500 BCE, we have the introduction of modern coinage with silver coins found in Lydia, which is part of modern-day Turkey. This technique caught on quickly as nearby Greek, Persian, and Macedonian cultures also adapted to using silver coin as currency. In 1816, gold was officially made the standard of value in England. Banknotes that individuals carried represented a specific amount of gold. The gold standard was enacted in the US in 1900, which helped lead to the establishment of the central bank. The Depression in the 1930s is going to mark the beginning of the end of the gold standard. As a result of the Depression, the US is going to revise their gold standard, which is going to devalue the price of gold, which will eventually lead to more future changes to the gold standard. In 1971, President Richard Nixon officially ended the gold standard, putting us where we are today with our use of fiat money. Hello AP Macro class, and welcome back for our Unit 4 review on the financial sector. In this review today, we are going to be taking a look at money and banking. We are going to be defining money and taking a look at how fractional reserve banking can lead to the creation of money. We will then move on to the money market and monetary policy. Here we will be introduced to the money market graph, which looks at the relationship between money supplied and money demanded. We will also see how the Federal Reserve can manipulate the macroeconomy using monetary policy. And our final topic for today's review will be the loanable funds market. This model is going to show us the interaction between borrowers and lenders in the market for loanable funds, and we will see what exactly happens to the loanable fund market when the government borrows money. We've all seen it and we can't get enough of it, but what exactly is money? Money is going to be any commodity or token that is generally accepted as a means of payment. What exactly do I mean by commodity or token? Well, money can be a commodity, such as a resource like gold or silver, or money can be a token, such as a quarter or a $5 bill. I also stated that money is generally accepted. What that means is that it can be used to buy generally anything and everything in an economy where that currency is accepted. So to differentiate between what would be considered money and what would not be considered money, I'm going to let my friend Dennis Reynolds give you a little lesson in economics. At the end of his lecture, I want you to determine whether or not a Dave & Buster's card would be considered money.
I want you to do me a favor. Break down for me what I'm holding in my hand right now.
That is a Dave & Buster's power card.
Yes. Now, does your Dave & Buster's card work at any other similar establishments, like, say, TGI Fridays?
Mine does not.
No, it doesn't.
Believe me, I've tried it. Several locations.
Okay, well, yeah, because if you recall, I've actually been with you on many of those occasions where you've tried.
Right. Yeah, I don't think I've tried it enough.
I think you have, because clearly, at this point, you should have realized that it doesn't work anywhere else.
There's one out in Franklin Mills I haven't tried. I feel like
it's not going to work there either. Okay, let's move past it. I'm trying to make a point here. When you come to Dave & Buster's, you spend your real money, but you leave with Dave & Buster's money. Okay, that gives you incentive to come back to Dave & Buster's because it's the only place where your money works. I think that's brilliant. Now maybe we should take a page out of D&B's book.
So, according to our definition of money, would a D&B card be considered money? Well, is it a token? Yes, it is. It can be used to go to any game in all of Dave & Buster's and inserted to allow you to have access to that game. That brings us to our second part. Is it generally accepted? No. As you can see, Mac tried to take it to the Chili's down the street, and they did not honor it. Money is going to perform three vital functions for us. It is going to act as a medium of exchange, meaning that I can go to the store, pick out a few items, take those items to the cash register, and then give the cashier money in exchange for those items. Money is also going to act as a unit of account, meaning it will be an agreed upon measure stating the prices for goods and services. An example of this could be something like houses and cars. A very large house that has a lot of modern technology is going to have a larger unit of account, so it might be worth upwards to $1 million, while an older, smaller house that is not as modern is going to have a smaller unit of account, and it could be something like $200,000. Lastly, money is going to act as a store of value. When you go to work and get paid with money, you can use that money whenever you want. You can decide on your way home to stop at the store and spend it all, or you can take it to the bank and save it for later. Regardless, it's your decision. It can be spent now or it can be saved for later. As I mentioned earlier, our money in the US is considered fiat money, meaning that it is the official currency by law. Fiat money is going to be good because it does not tie up any real resources, and it allows the money supply to be manipulated in order to help the economy. However, there can be instances of counterfeit currency, and printing too much money can lead to inflation and eventually hyperinflation. Just like supply and demand aggregates, we also have money aggregates. Money can be categorized as either M1 money or M2 money. M1 money is going to be things like official currency, a travel traveler's check, or the money in your bank account. M2 money is going to be all of M1 money plus savings deposits and small time deposits. The main difference between M1 money and M2 money is that M1 money is going to have more liquidity. Suppose you could have $1,000 today or $1,000 next year. Which would you choose? Think about the reasons for why you would make the decision you made. Well, I'm just going to assume we are all thinking the same thing, that it is better to have that money today. But why exactly does this make more sense? Well, if we accept this $1,000 today, we get to decide what we want to do with it. We could either spend it on something we want right now, or we could put it into a savings account that will generate interest. So our $1,000 would become more than $1,000 in the future. So why exactly is money today always going to be worth more than money tomorrow? Why could it possibly be a smarter investment for us to take $100 today rather than $120 a year from now? How does having money make more money? All those questions are going to be answered as we look at the time value of money. Because of the interest rate, money that is lent out will receive regular payments added on top of principal. Interest rate is going to be calculated using both nominal and real values. Nominal interest rates are just going to be interest rates without accounting for inflation. So if our nominal interest rates are set at 12% and our inflation rate is at 15%, if we loan someone money during that time, after we receive the full payment of our loan back, we will actually have less purchasing power than we did prior to loaning out the money. This is because we have to account for our real interest rate, which is just going to be our nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. Calculating the time value of money is going to allow us to see how much money we can make by lending out money or saving it in an account with an interest rate. It also allows us to see if we borrow money today, how much will we owe in a certain period of time. So how exactly do we go about calculating this time value of money? First, we need to understand the difference between the present value of money and the future value of money, since their calculations are going to be a little bit different. The present value of money basically states that money today is going to be worth more than money tomorrow, while the future value of money is going to be how much money we will receive as a result of interest as it accumulates over a certain amount of time. So if I were to lend out $100 today, how much money would I have a year from now? To calculate the future value of money, we use the following formula. Future value equals present value, 1 plus our interest rate to the nth power. And n is just going to be how many years or how many months are going by in this equation. Generally, we're just going to be using years. The present value is going to be the cost, so whatever we're loaning out or whatever loan we're receiving, over top of 1 plus interest to the nth power, n again being the amount of years past. So let's take a look at an example. If your grandma said you could have $5,000 when you graduated from college 4 years from now, what would that money be worth today? So how do we go about figuring this out? Well, without knowing the interest rate, we have no idea how to calculate this. So let's say we just have a set interest rate at 5%. Since we are going to see how much money $5,000 4 years from now is going to be worth today, we are going to choose the present value formula. So let's plug in the numbers. Our present value equals $5,000, 1 plus our interest rate of 0.05 to the 4th power. This gives us our present value of $4,113. Well, what if the interest rate changes? Up here on the screen, you can see there's an empty place for our interest rates at both 3% and 10%. I want you to pause the video and try and figure out the present value of that $5,000 if rates were at these 2 points. Using our formula with interest rates at 3%, we can see that the present value of our $5,000 would be $4,442. And at 10%, you can see that our present value of money would be about $3,415. What relationship are you seeing between higher and lower interest rates? The higher the interest rate, the lower your present value of money will be. Calculating the future value will have the same concept. Let's say you are going to loan a friend $100 and you want them to pay that money back 2 years from today. With inflation in mind, you decide to charge him a 10% interest rate. So now we just plug our numbers into the formula. We take our $100 and multiply that by 1 plus our interest rate of 10%, so 0.1, since we're being paid back 2 years from now. This gives us our future value of $121. So 2 years from now, you would have made a $21 profit on the interest of your loan. Next, we are going to be talking about the banking system. So banks work by taking money as deposits and using that money to lend out out to other customers. What exactly is fractional reserve banking? It is going to be the practice of where banks accept deposits and make loans as investments. But by law, they are going to be required a portion of their deposits equal to only a fraction of the bank's liability. The minimum amount of funds that a bank is required to hold by law is going to be referred to as the bank's required reserves. If a bank had $100 in deposits and the required reserves was 10%, that means that the bank would be free to loan out $90, but they must take $10 and put it aside. Regardless of this reserve requirement, banks are still going to create money in the economy through the money multiplier. In our last unit, we took a look at fiscal policy and the spending multiplier. The money multiplier with banks is going to be very, very similar. With the reserve requirement at 10%, let's say that Bill goes to the bank and deposits $100. The bank then takes $10 to put in its reserve requirement and it loans out the other $90. Well, let's say this $90 then gets loaned out to Bob. Well, what's Bob going to do? Bob's going to take this $90 and he's going to put it in his bank. So with the reserve requirement, the bank is going to be required to take 9 of those dollars and put it aside, and it's going to loan out the other $81. This goes on and on and on and on, and our money keeps on getting multiplied. But how exactly do we calculate the total money multiplier based off of one initial deposit? Well, we use the money multiplier. The money multiplier is simply going to be 1 over our reserve ratio. Since our reserve ratio is 10%, we are going to take 1 and put it over 0.1 to get our money multiplier of 10. Now we take the $90 that was initially loaned out after our initial deposit and multiply that by our money multiplier of 10, and we see that $900 was added to the economy as a result of this initial deposit. You may be thinking to yourself, why did we not take the initial deposit of $100 and multiply that against our money multiplier? Well, the reason is Bill's money was already part of the money supply. So it was not until he deposited that money into the bank and a portion of his initial deposit was loaned out did it cause new money to be created. The only time this will not apply is when the Federal Reserve buys bonds from banks, because this will be new money introduced into the economy. Now we are going to take a look at how banks are able to keep track of all these financial transactions. Here on your screen you see a bank balance sheet. Bank balance sheets are going to show us specific liabilities and assets of a bank. Assets are going to be things that the bank owns, while liabilities are going to be what a bank owes. Assets and liabilities will always equal each other. It makes sense in the name, a bank balance sheet. They will always balance out. We already mentioned that the required reserves are the percentage of funds that a bank must hold on the side, but we also see now that we have some other categories. Excess reserves are going to be available funds that the bank is allowed to loan out. As you can see on the liability side, we have something called demand deposits. These are just going to be money that has been deposited by customers of the bank. So if you have PNC or Bank of America, whenever you take a paycheck or cash to the bank and deposit it, that would go into that demand deposit section of a bank balance sheet. Owner's equity just refers to money that is owed to the owners and the shareholders of the bank. Remember, banks are still businesses. They need to make a profit. So on our specific balance sheet up here, you see that both assets and liabilities equal $20,000. Given this information, what is our reserve ratio? Well, since our assets show that we have $4,000 in required reserves and $20,000 total, we know that we have a reserve requirement of 20%. So in this scenario, banks are going to be required to hold 20% of their funds. Well, let's say that the Federal Reserve comes in and purchases $5,000 worth of government-backed securities from our bank. $5,000 worth of bonds that the bank was holding has now been sold to the government, freeing up this cash into our excess reserves, allowing the bank to now loan out this money. Now, how much money will be created as a result of this transaction? We plug in our reserve ratio of 0.2 into our formula for the money multiplier, and we see that we get a money multiplier of 5. So we take the initial deposit of $5,000 and simply multiply it by our money multiplier of 5, and we see that the money supply increased by up to $25,000. So how would this be different if an individual were to deposit $5,000 into the bank? Well, the initial deposit would not cause a change in the money supply since this money was already part of the money supply. Instead, it would increase by $20,000 since we don't account for our initial deposit. In the United States, in the year 1913, Congress wanted to provide the nation with a more stable, safer, and flexible monetary and financial system. In doing so, they founded the Federal Reserve Bank, which is the central banking system for the United States. Over the years, the roles of the Federal Reserve Bank has expanded and changed tremendously. Today, the biggest role of the Federal Reserve is as the nation's monetary policy authority. Monetary policy is going to involve manipulating the availability and the cost of money and credit to promote a healthy economy. The goals of the Federal Reserve include maximum sustainable output and steady employment, as well as stable prices, which means low, stable inflation. The Fed's most frequently used monetary policy tool is going to be open market operations. To understand open market operations, you have to understand the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is just going to be the rate at which banks borrow and spend excess reserves. When more reserves are available in the banking system, the federal funds rate goes lower, reflecting an excess of supply over demand, a move that is set to encourage consumers and businesses to take out more loans. When the feds buy securities through open market operations, banks will have more money to loan out in their excess reserves. Additional money in these bank reserve accounts puts a downward pressure on the federal funds rate. This makes it easier for banks to loan out money. This leads to lower interest rates, which encourages consumer and business spending. If the FMOC raises its target for the federal funds rate, then the Fed will sell government-backed securities to banks, collecting cash payments, taking away from the bank's excess reserves, which will eventually lead to increased interest rates and discourage borrowing. The Fed does this if it believes the economy will or is experiencing unanticipated inflation. Just like fiscal policy, monetary policy can be either expansionary or contractionary. Expansionary monetary policy is just going to be when the Fed increases the money supply. The Fed uses expansionary monetary policy as an act to try and stimulate a stagnant economy. Contractionary monetary policy is going to be when the Fed takes money out of the money supply in order to fight unanticipated inflation or to slow down a fast-pacing economy. To understand how the actions of the Federal Reserve is going to affect the economy, we have to understand how the money market model works. As you can see on our money market model, we have nominal interest rates on our y-axis and the quantity of money on our x-axis. Then we see a downward sloping demand curve, which is going to represent our demand for money. Now, when I say demand for money, obviously everyone is going to demand money all the time, but what we are going to mean by demand for money is just going to be the demand for holding on to any amount of money that is outside of our normal everyday transactions. So what exactly is our opportunity cost of holding on to money rather than having it invested in other financial assets? This explains why our demand for money is downward sloping. As nominal interest rates rise and the opportunity cost for having cash on hand is high, you're not going to want to hold too much money. This is because this money could be making you more money elsewhere, so the stock market or real estate. However, if nominal interest rates start to decrease, our opportunity cost for holding on to money starts to decrease as well. This is because we will not see much of a return if our money were placed elsewhere. With that low opportunity cost and money being a very liquid asset, it just makes sense to hold on to it at that point. Just like all of our demand curves, the demand for money also has its shifters. These shifters are going to be real GDP and price level. A change in real GDP is going to have a direct impact on the demand for money. If real GDP is decreasing, that is a sign of lower output, and we are functioning below our potential GDP. A decrease in price level brings down the cost of living, meaning the demand for holding on to excess money decreases as we see our curve shift left. Americans have a lot more money in their pockets than they did 50 years ago. One of the major reasons for this is because it costs a lot more today to buy a certain item than it did 50 years ago. See for yourself. Google the price of gas today, then just Google a random date either 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, and you'll notice that the price has dramatically increased from those dates. As price level increases, consumers need more money as a result of lowering purchasing power, so our demand for money would shift right. All other things equal, the demand for money will always be proportional with a change in price level. Any increase or decrease in the demand for money will lead to an increase or decrease in price level. Now we are going to introduce the supply of money curve into our money market model. As you can see, the supply of money curve is going to be vertical. What does this tell us about the trade-off between the supply of money and interest rates? Well, this shows us that there is none. We see that no matter what the interest rate is, the supply of money is going to stay exactly the same. Any action taken by the Federal Federal Reserve will lead to a shift in our supply curve for money. The Federal Reserve can shift its supply of money using three tools: reserve ratio, discount rate, and open market operation. By manipulating the reserve ratio, the Fed is able to determine how much money a bank has to hold in its required reserves. When banks are required to hold more money in its required reserves, this leads to less money in the economy, leading to a leftward shift on our supply curve. You see that this leftward shift leads to increased interest rates and a decrease for the demand for money. Another tool that the Feds have at their disposal is changing the discount rate. The discount rate is just going to be the interest rate that the Feds charge banks to borrow money. If the Feds decrease the discount rate, banks will be more encouraged to borrow money, which they will be able to loan out. This will increase the money supply, and we will see a rightward shift in the supply of money. This leads to lower interest rates and more of a demand for money. The last and most commonly used tool used by the Federal Reserve is going to be open market operations. As mentioned earlier, open market operations are just going to be when the Fed buys and sells government-backed securities to banks. When the Fed buys bonds from banks, this frees up that bank's excess reserves, allowing them to loan out more money. This increases the money supply as we see a rightward shift in the supply curve. At lower interest rates, we see our demand for money decrease. Remember, this is just because at lower interest rates, our opportunity cost for holding on to money is also low. Remember, at these lower interest rates, it doesn't necessarily make sense to go through the trouble of putting this money in other financial assets. And our last topic will be the market for loanable funds. Since there are so many different financial markets in the financial system, economists often use a simplified model where they assume that there is only one market that brings together all lenders and all borrowers. This will be known as our market for loanable funds. The loanable funds model is going to show how interest rates are determined by looking at the supply and demand of loanable funds. Here's the model for the loanable funds market. You can see on our y-axis we have real interest rates, while on our x-axis we have quantity of loans. In this model, our downward sloping demand curve will represent individuals who demand loans or want to borrow money, while our upward sloping supply curve will represent those who wish to lend out money or those who wish to supply money. For our supply of loanable funds, we have two events that can shift our curve: changes in private saving behavior or changes in capital inflows. If private saving behavior decreases and people decide they want to save more money, the supply for loanable funds will shift right, leading to lower interest rates and a larger quantity of funds available to be loaned out. Since people are going to be less willing to borrow money, suppliers of money or lenders are going to be more willing to lend out money at lower rates. When capital flows into an economy, that just means that investors outside of that economy in other countries are placing their assets in another country's economy. This leads to a rightward shift in the supply of loanable funds. We now see an increase in the amount of firms willing to provide loanable funds. Well, what can lead to a shift on the demand side of things? One shifter is going to be perceived business opportunities. In 2017, the U.S. Small Business Optimism Index reached its highest level since the survey began in 1973. Small businesses were dramatically increasing their expenditures and investments into capital goods and inventories. With this increase in expenditure, businesses needed more money. As a result, they required loans. We see a rightward shift in the demand for loanable funds. Another demand shifter for the market of loanable funds is going to be government spending. When a government is running a budget deficit, its spending exceeds its income. This money has to come from somewhere, so where exactly does it come from? Well, it's going to come from the loanable funds market. If the government increases expenditure during a deficit and borrows money, this is going to increase the demand for loanable funds and shift our loanable funds curve to the right, leading to higher interest rates and a lower quantity of loanable funds. The act of the government tapping into the loanable funds market is a concept known as crowding out. In our previous shifter for the demand of loanable funds, we saw that a rightward shift was a result of a booming economy where small businesses needed more money to increase their capital investment. However, with crowding out, it is due to government deficit spending. So the government comes in and sort of crowds everyone out of the loanable funds market, taking all the loans, driving interest rates up. This makes it harder for others to take out loans at this time. On March 25th of 2020, the United States Congress launched a historic stimulus package bill of $2 trillion, aiming at diverting the effects that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on American families. The problem was the government did not have $2 trillion ready to spend. The government ended up taking out loans from the loanable funds market, crowding out everyone else by driving up interest rates dramatically. All right, my friends, that is it for our Unit 4 review on the financial sector. Now, on to the FRQ. that FRQ by Friday to Google Classrooms. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me and I would do my best to help you out. I hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, time for me to make like a banana and leave.